practitioners who are very well versed with oral ovulagens, but whenever it comes to gonadotropins, it becomes still a big taboo. And also what is important for us is that we need to understand that the patient who is put on gonadotropins, we have to understand that they can have all kinds of responses, and hyperstimulation is something which many people are still scared of. But today, if you understand gonadotropins, then definitely you will understand that there are many clinics who have not seen hyperstimulation for years. So let us just understand a little bit about the follicular genesis. So when we look at, we have all kinds of, the ovary is full of millions and millions of follicles. We start with primordial follicle, then primary and secondary follicle, then early antral and pre-ovulatory. Now we need to understand that till this stage, till the early antral stage, just before that, this is totally independent of gonadotropins, and they are totally not responsive to gonadotropins. And after the antral stage is something which is where they will start responding to the gonadotropins. And along with that, when the follicle is growing, like very few follicles are growing, and why they grow, we will just understand. But there are many more who will undergo apoptosis and will also degenerate in the process and undergo atresia. So we are losing out on a lot of follicles to make one Graafian follicle grow. So this whole cycle of follicular genesis actually takes almost more than 220 days. And it has three very distinct phases. One is the one which we just saw, the initial recruitment of the resting primordial follicles. Then the development of the pre-antral and the early antral. Now, this is something which is independent of gonadotropins. Nothing is going to push this forward. It just comes internally. And the third phase is the cyclical recruitment of the antral follicles. And this is what you see on ultrasound scan on day 2 or at any point of time of the menstrual cycle. Antral follicles will be seen in the ovary until one goes up and grows into a Graafian follicle, and this is the phase which is actually dependent on the gonadotropins. Now we need to, when we understand a little bit about the physiology and the endocrinology, that is the time when we will be actually able to optimum use of our stimulation protocols. So when we are looking at this, we understand that there are a lot of things which have an influence on the growth of the follicles or on the recruitment of the follicles. So we move forward from here and also understand that what we understood before was that there is a single phase of or a single wave of follicular growth. Today we understand that the follicles grow in waves. So it's 1, 2 or 3 waves. So if you see here, it is not that only the follicle will start growing from day 2. If it was true, then we would have not been able to do dual stimulation. We would have not been able to do a delayed start or a luteal phase stimulation of the follicles, because the antral follicles are present throughout the cycle. And the moment we cross the threshold of FSH for these follicles, you can make them grow at any point of time. So this wave understanding has actually led us to making a lot more new protocols, and especially I would say where we need fertility preservation for all those malignancy patients, where waiting for another 15 or 20 days also can be a problem. These newer options of ovarian stimulation have given us a lot of insight into, who's moving the slides, I don't know. So this understanding has led to invention of a lot more protocols. Now, a follicle grows when the threshold for that, for FSH threshold for that follicle has crossed. So that is why I'll just literally put it that why sometimes when you see 10, 12 antral follicles and when you give any kind of ovarian stimulation, you only see 1, 2, 3 follicles growing, and the rest of them don't grow, because each follicle also does not have the same threshold for FSH. And they also sometimes have, different levels. And the recruitment also happens according to the dose. So if you're looking at, and as soon as the FSH and the E2 levels start going up, then an LH surge happens, then there is a stop to the other rest of the follicles from growing. Now, that is something which is spontaneous cycle, but in the conventionally stimulated or cycles, what we do is that there is one thing which is called as FSH threshold and the other is FSH window. So what we do is that we are increasing the threshold also and we are also increasing the window. That's why a larger number of follicles actually get recruited when you are doing a conventional ovarian stimulation protocol. Now, there are many factors which can affect ovarian stimulation. The first and the foremost is age, BMI, then ethnicity, smoking or other, habits. Then other factors which are again very important. Then there are many other things which we do not understand, which is something like, FSH or LH receptor polymorphism, or there could be a poor response, or there could be a risk tolerance. And a lot of drug tolerance develops in patients whom we give urinary proteins. So that's where urinary proteins, where the urinary gonadotropins, they have urinary proteins, and those are the patients that you keep on giving gonadotropins of urinary origin. They do develop some kind of a resistance and they sometimes need higher doses later on. Now, the other factors which can affect fertility outcome, apart from what we have discussed, is there are a lot of these negative factors on periconceptional lifestyle, which again needs to be modulated. And it has been seen that if these factors are present, then time to pregnancy definitely increases. Now, let us again understand the follicle output rate. Now, here you are seeing number of antral follicles, and then you have started a protocol and you only see about 30% of these follicles are actually growing. So this suggests hypersensitivity to FSH. Now, if you see this number and almost about 80% of them start growing, that means that is maybe your dose is right and there is adequate response to the stimulation protocol in this particular patient. So follicle output ratio or rate is something which you should always look into, so that in case if the patient has not responded well in the first cycle, then all the other changes have to be made, whether it is dose increase or addition of LH, all those need to be understood, and then the reforms have to be made. Now, ovarian reserve tests and the biomarkers. What do we really understand by that, and what do we really depend on? Today, a lot of people, we are all talking about AMH. It is emerging out to be a good ovarian reserve test, and a lot of protocols have started developing around it. But I would still say that AFC, we need to looking at developing a protocol for any particular patient, because age is one single criteria which will predict a good quality. More than 60% of the oocytes in patients who are, let's say, more than 35 years of age are aneuploidy, and 40% are aneuploidy after 35, and about 60% are aneuploidy after 40 years. So age is quite a good predictor for quality, and AMH and AFC are a good predictor for the quantity. So when you put all these together, then definitely your chances of getting a good protocol are going to be much, much better. Secondly, the cycle length also gives you a lot of insight into the patient's, how you're going to really look into and start the stimulation protocol. Now, let us say the younger patient, this is a younger patient, and if you see here, the FSH, now this is the first day of the menstruation. So FSH rises just before the menstrual cycle. Now, this is where the recruitment of the antral follicles actually takes place for this particular cycle. Now, if you look in the older patient, this rise has happened much earlier. So what will happen on day 2 when you'll see the follicles here? You will see antral follicles of the size between, let's say, 5-6 millimeters or so. But you will see follicles which are 9-10 millimeters. And that really explains why the length is shorter, because this patient will gets ready in the next 5, 7, 8 days. The endometrium also is develop the synchrony between the endometrium and the follicle. That's again to gonadotropins. Now we have gonadotropins. You've just heard a talk on antagonist. Gonadotropins came very early, like in the 20s, and slowly is a beautiful article by Bruno Lowenfeld on the gonadotropins and how they evolved and how research has taken us up now to recombinant and biosimilar FSH, which is again available in our country. Now, but still a lot of understanding is required whether we are using urinary products and recombinant products. Now, what is the difference? If we are looking at outcome, then maybe in the first few cycles, there is absolutely not much difference if you're using a urinary product or a recombinant product. Now, urinary product means what? Urine of menopausal women is very high in FSH and LH. So barrels and barrels of urine is collected and FSH and LH is extracted from it. But what really happens is that the end result will always have some contamination, which this contamination can be because of non-FSH human proteins. It is in the form of LH, this thing. So even a highly purified urinary FSH will have small amount of LH. It is not bad to have LH with FSH because as it is we require, but there are certain areas where it might be a little bit detrimental. Plus, what the major problem with urinary products is that there's a batch-to-batch variability because it all depends upon what the source is and how it has been done. So many times, especially people who are doing batch IVF, if somebody has, let's say, a pickup on a particular day, it will just so happen that all the patients will get ready 2 days earlier or all the patients may get late. So we need to understand that whenever we are using these products, we must be a little flexible on our availability, especially IVF. IUI still, it's okay because IUI can be easily managed. So, and the recombinant drugs, they are genetically engineered, so they are absolutely pure. They are very highly specific biological activity is there. And plus, there is no batch-to-batch variability. But as far as the pregnancy rates are concerned, there is absolutely no difference between these two. And these recombinant products actually can be given subcutaneously also, which is, I think, more acceptable to the patient. So what do we really understand? That both urinary gonadotropins, especially HMG and recombinant FSH, actually have similar efficacy in terms of achieving a pregnancy or a live birth, but the other problems or the other issues actually are there. Now, a little bit more about FSH. Now, when we are looking at recombinant FSH, there are 3 products which are currently available, which is polytropin alpha, polytropin beta, and polytropin delta. Now, we understand alpha and beta are the ones that are very commonly used, and they are the ones where all of them they have a short biological activities, half-life, and that's why it necessitates a daily administration. But we right now also have a long-acting recombinant FSH of analog of alpha, which is corifolitropin, and that has a half-life of almost 24 hours or 70 hours. So that what does that mean? That you can actually give an injection and it will have its effect for almost about 6 to 7 days, and the next injection has to be given in a day dose form for the last 3 or 4 days. And alpha or beta, whether, whatever you are using, despite of whatever little disparities are there, there are some differences as far as, the acidic and the basic nature of these concerned. But when a head-to-head clinical trial was done between these products, it was seen that there was absolutely no significant difference as far as the efficacy and the safety is concerned. So now let us understand, when we are going to patient who should keep the aims in mind, because the dose and the protocol will depend on that. So you can have a modified natural where only HCG or maybe an antagonist is used. You can have mild stimulation protocols which are much softer, where the aim is only to have about 6 to 7 oocytes. And then there's a conventional protocol where more than 8 oocytes are expected, and the protocols are also similar. So is there any ideal protocol for stimulation? The answer is no. So we really need to individualize. That is very important. And individualization also again depends upon many parameters. What is the patient for? What is a patient? The BMI, whether she has cystic ovarian syndrome or no, how obese she is, plus whether I'm going to buy ovulation. So there are a lot of things which actually have to be put in place before you choose the protocol. But what we have to understand is that if a woman is high responding, you need to have a moderating approach. And if she is a normal responding patient, you need to have a maximizing approach. That means the best outcome of oocytes is what you should be intending. And if she has a poor response, then a creative approach, so that how can you maximize the number of eggs from her is what is important. Now, what is normal? That's again important. So we normally do a scan, and here you see that the AFC is very low. You can already see that's a day 2 scan, 2 very big follicles and another 2 which are small. And this is a normal responder, and this could be a high responder where you can get more than 15. So here is what we would say a moderating approach, and we'll give a dose which is lesser, let's say about 150 international units. Normal will respond to even this and this and every. Now, then you need to understand what is the aim. If your aim is this much, to get about 10 to 15 oocytes, maybe 150 to 225 would be a good dose. But the problem arises with poor responders, because poor responders, you don't know the threshold. Even the high responders also, PC, you don't know the threshold. They may be high responders, but they still may not respond to a smaller dose. You might have to still increase the dose. So we need to understand, and there are many parameters which can actually help you, especially a previous history can also help you on how she was responding to clomiphen or other things. But poor responders, normally people start with a little higher dose, which is about 300 IU. But we always take into consideration the age and also the BMI. Now, why do we do that, which is important? That in a young patient, you just might need about good 6 M2 oocytes to get to good blastocysts. And you have to understand here that the euploidy rate of the embryos is what we normally keep in mind when you're looking at oocytes. But as the age advances, for getting these 2 euploid, let's say, embryos, you need 5 blastocysts, and for those 5 blastocysts, you will need 16 M2s, and that may not be possible. So that will probably lead you to dual stimulation or egg accumulation. And here I've just given you a protocol. This is not right now available in India, but some trials have happened in India, and I hope it will be soon available, because there was some problem about the permissions for this to be sold. But I think once this comes, then give 1 injection of colintropin alpha on day 1, and then the next injection comes on day 8. Obviously, antagonist, wherever has to be added, will be added. So how do we really select a protocol? Protocol or high responder, then low also, whether poor or suboptimal. It depends upon the aim, AMH and also the AFC. And that's again very important. I'm going to come into a little bit detail a little later. So all depends upon patient segmentation. So you have to profile the patient, you have to look into all those things and then set up a protocol. Now, a lot of people ask me this question, does type and dose yes, one extra egg or one extra embryo. So that's why we normally do not follow a fixed protocol. We follow an individualized protocols because individualized protocols do not really increase the live birth rate, but they definitely increase the safety and the effectiveness, which is of real importance. So that's what we normally look into when we are individualizing the dose and the protocol for these patients. But another very important aspect which we have to see is time to live birth. Now that's very important because we normally are looking at the cost and the outcomes, but we sometimes do not look into time to live birth, which is also equally important for the patient. And that's why selection of the protocol and optimizing results with freezing and making it as convenient for the patient is much important. This used to be our initial protocol, which would take this is an agonist protocol. Very few patients today we put on agonist protocol. Most of them are now, we have shifted almost about 80% of the cycles or maybe 90% on antagonist protocol, which is shorter, which is less painful, lesser number of injections and also cost effective. Plus rapid reversibility is there. That's why you can just go ahead and do another stimulation immediately afterwards. Now, what type of gonadotropins are available? As I said, urinary, you have HMG, you have highly purified HMG, then you have recombinant FSH, recombinant LH, and recombinant HCG. They are all available, and we understand that the efficacy of all these, especially the recombinant products, is really more than 99% or 100% pure, and there is no batch-to-batch variability. So when we move forward, how do you really now stratify treatment protocols? So this is the most popular method, and this is based on Scott Nelson's criteria, where you put the AFC on one side and on the AMH on the other side, and we stratify patients into reduced response, normal response, and high responders. And then we see that the high responders and the normal responders will do very well with antagonist protocol with agonist trigger, especially for high response. Wherever you're wanting to freeze the cycles or even otherwise, maybe agonist trigger is something which one should be considering. But normal responders can do well with both, whether it's antagonist protocol and HCG trigger or an agonist protocol. And the reduced response is something where you need to try and individualize based upon many other factors. And the doses I've already discussed. High responders, we start 150 IU and we increase as soon as we are looking at a poor responder. So if you're looking here, whether we are an algorithm based on ovarian reserve tests versus a standard dose, we are looking at that if we are comparing the two, then mostly it favors ovarian reserve test based algorithm, which helps us in choosing the dose and it increases the safety and efficacy of the protocol. Now let's come to a little bit about some problem areas like PCOS. PCOS can have majority of the problems: excess ovarian response, lower fertilization rate, high number of immature oocytes, reduced cleavage rate, low implantation, and high miscarriage rate. And there are many kinds of these problems can be overcome with many protocols which we need to understand and discuss. Now, we are looking at a moderate response in PCOS, and we are also looking at a major problem is to reduce the incidence of hyperstimulation. And antagonist protocol with agonist trigger is the one which has basically made most of the clinics OHSS free. Another very important thing I'd like to tell you here is that if we are able to stratify the patients based on their phenotypes, like you have phenotype A, which are anovulatory PCOS, who have hyperandrogenemia, ovulatory dysfunction, and have a morphologically PCO ovaries. Now, this is type A. Type B will not have a PCO morphology, but will have hyperandrogenemia. And then phenotype C is the one where ovulatory dysfunction will be there. And D is non-hyperandrogenic, where you have ovulatory dysfunction and PCOS. Hyperandrogenemia is not there. We are at the highest risk of insulin resistance and frank diabetes mellitus, while D is the one which will have least chances of getting it, and phenotype C is somewhere in the middle. Now, the ones which have morphology of polycystic ovaries are at a higher risk of hyperstimulation. So these are the ones which we must be really looking into and starting with a little higher, with a little lower dose. And that is a good way of preventing hyperstimulation. But counseling is very important, because the moment you see a polycystic ovarian syndrome patient, always counsel the patient and the attendant that if there are more number of oocytes retrieved, then we should be looking at a freeze-all, which is important to prevent her from hyperstimulation. Second important thing is, today we have agonist trigger. When we did not have agonist trigger, we used to reduce the dose of HCG. And today with the agonist trigger, we have the rescue cycles where you can add a little bit of HCG and rescue the cycle and still do a transfer if you're not freezing all or if the patient doesn't understand. Initially, what we used to do was we used to reduce the dose of HCG, and I don't think we do this anymore. Other thing which we can do for OHSS free clinic is segmentation. And what is segmentation? Segmentation has, we have different steps. It basically consists of optimization of the ovarian stimulation, including a GnRH agonist triggering in an antagonist cycle. The segment B consists of optimum cryopreservation methods for the oocyte or embryo, and segment C which includes embryo replacement in a receptive non-stimulated endometrium in a natural cycle or with an artificially endometrial preparation. Now, you could do a freeze-all or a freeze-for-all. Now, these strategies, actually, because of lack of time, I don't think I can discuss much of it. But we normally do not suggest a universal freeze-all strategy, because a lot of times, poor responders, or maybe for normal responders also, it could be a problem. Now, let's come to poor ovarian response. Now, we have had this recently classification for responders, which is Poseidon's this classification. And we have seen that you have patients stratified as under 35 who have an adequate reserve, but a suboptimal or an unexpected suboptimal response. And you have a group of Poseidon 2 where you have more than 35, and though the reserve is good, but still a suboptimal response. Now, Poseidon 3 is where the patient is under 35 but has poor ovarian reserve. And 4 is again above 35 but with a poor ovarian reserve. Now, can they all be treated similar? Now, we need to understand also is that these 3, 1, 2, and 4, they will benefit, especially when you're looking at transferring, they will benefit with addition of LH. And LH can be avoided in this because we are always looking for areas and improving a lot of patients where you want the outcomes to be much better. Now, there are many, the problems with poor responders is sometimes, asynchrony between, because as I have already told you, that the FSH rises earlier and there will be a few follicles which are larger, especially on day 2. So there we could probably think about, initially what we used to do was that you would give them estradiol priming, for 4 or 5 days. It would help in synchronization also, and then start gonadotropins and antagonists. Now, another new protocol which has come up nowadays, which is being tried, is that you give estradiol priming for 5-6 days, then put on GnRH antagonist for 7 days, and then start gonadotropins. Now, this is what we call as a delayed start antagonist controlled ovarian stimulation protocol. And what you see here is that the percentage of cycles with oocyte retrieval in the delayed start are much better than the conventional protocols. Now, exogenous LH supplementation, where is it required? Most of the times we say that yes, poor responders are the ones who would do well with LH supplementation. If the age group is more than 35 years, yes, you must do. If there is a suboptimal response to FSH, those are the patients also you would do. And if there is a resistance to the response, like sometimes, follicle stagnation is there even in a normal responder or in a PCOS, or if there has been an extreme down regulation where the baseline LH has gone below 1 international unit, those are the patients where you would use LH supplementation. And it is always recommended that if you're giving LH, you must give it from day one and not add it in the middle of the cycle. Dual stimulation, yes, a lot of people who are, practicing for fertility preservation, dual stimulation is a great idea. Secondly, especially for poor responders, this is the second place where we use dual stimulation. And today, a number of clinics have a lot of experience with dual stimulation, and that can easily be taken up. Asynchronous follicle growth, I have already told you that what we do is put the patient on estradiol valerate for about 4 milligrams for 5 to 6 days, and then start stimulation. Otherwise, also you could put them on progesterone for about 10 days before the periods are due, and then take it up as a normal day 2 stimulation protocol. Fertility preservation, again, gonadotropins are used. You could use dual stimulation. You could use a random start protocol. And there are many other protocols which have been individualized by different clinics. I know that there is a whole talk on adjuvants and antioxidant therapy for patients. I would just like to say here, we try a lot of things for poor responders. Today we know growth hormone supplementation may not improve the live birth rates in poor responders. Even androgens, DHEA, we are very used to giving. This also, there is not much evidence that they improve the response. Folic acid is something we give for prevention of neural tube defects. Vitamin D, again, what has come up is that women who are replete with vitamin D, they do better than the ones who are deficient in vitamin D. So vitamin D is something one should be really looking into. And in current practice, aspirin as an adjuvant to ART, there is absolutely no role. I'd like to really end up here and say that ovarian stimulation or ovulation induction, as we have seen in the last 3 decades, our understanding has grown by leaps and bounds. And today, every day we are understanding a lot more things. Just about a few years back, we never understood the follicular waves will happen. And today, by understanding that, today we are now trying a number of different kinds of protocols like dual stimulation, random start protocol, and so on. So what we need to understand is that one needs to keep your eyes and ears open. One needs to understand the profile of the patient. One also needs to understand the drugs which we are using and the endocrinology. And if you understand that, then the interplay of all this becomes much, much more easier. So looking forward, I hope that you all have enjoyed this deliberation. And if you have any questions, we will deal with it at the end of the talk. So thank you very much, and greetings from Agra and the lovely Taj Mahal.
Dr. Jaydeep, for a wonderful, exhaustive masterclass on injectable gonadotropins, and I'm sure our attendees have enjoyed this session well. And we will be